Greetings, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on what time you are joining us. This is your host of Leadership Files, Ndlovu, broadcasting live from the USA. Today, I am talking to Olivia Tutu. She is a young lady, a young leader dedicated to bringing about change. So find out more what type of change in terms of youth development, advocating for she's a youth advocate, and she's going to share with us the spectrum, because when you talk about youth advocacy, it comes from different angles. So we are just privileged to interact with her, to learn about her organization, what she's all about, and what she's been doing, and what she's planning to do. So without further ado, let us connect to Olivia. So Olivia, welcome to our program.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me.
We are certainly excited and blessed to connect, to have this conversation with you. So there could be a lot of people who may not know exactly who Olivia Tutu is and what you do when you started doing what you're doing. So tell us a little bit about who Olivia is before we get into the organization. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Okay, great. So my name is Olivia Tutu, as introduced, and I am a youth development specialist based in Zambia. I'm also an advocate for the 17 Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, and I run a youth-led organization called Youth on Sustainable Development, whose aim is to basically empower and equip young people to drive in on sustainable development within Zambia and across the continent of Africa. The organization focuses on three frameworks: Agenda 2063, the Africa we want of the African Union; Agenda 2030, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals; and Zambia's National Development Plan, to ensure that young people are agents of change in their communities, seeing that both Zambia and Africa's population is largely below the age of 35. We want young people to be actively engaged in conversations around the development of our continent, the development of our country, because in the next 10, 15 years, we will be the ones taking up the decision-making roles. So even before we get into that space, how do we ensure that young people are consistently being involved in the decisions that are happening now, so that when the handover is done in a couple of years from now, we will know where we're coming from, where we will be, and where we need to be. So in a nutshell, that is Olivia.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. So it's always encouraging, I must say, to see young people getting involved in the development of the country, whether it's a particular country like Zambia or the continent at large. So before we start, what is development? How would you describe development?
So development is basically, so I like to define sustainable development, right? Because I think
Yeah.
before now, we've had the whole idea of development that has landed us into where we are now. So now the world has moved from just development to sustainable development. How do we develop in a sustainable way? Which is basically, how do we meet today's needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs? And I believe, for me, that's how development is in a nutshell: being able to sustainably feed into today's needs without compromising the ability of future generations. The reason why we are having things like climate change right now is because back in the day, when development was being spoken about and people wanted to ensure that the humanity had some level of development in terms of infrastructure, transportation, and things like that, you found that they were not thinking of the consequences of future generations. So now when we're speaking about development, we're speaking about it in a more sustainable way. How do we ensure that we are developing today, yes, but we are not compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs as well?
Mm-hmm. All right. Yeah. I think well put. So, in terms of getting started with this movement, your organization, what sort of triggered you to venture on this path? How did you get started?
I would say representation, because I'm very big on representation and I have seen it how it's transformed my life. But I would say it's a personal story. When I got done with varsity in 2023, I got into the corporate space, into the private sector. I was working as a social media manager and marketing intern, but I realized to say I wasn't getting the fulfillment that I needed in terms of reaching real life people. I mean, of course, for every business, there's a need that they are feeding into in the grand scheme of the economy. But for me, I have always had a passion towards people. And throughout my varsity years, I used to volunteer with different local organizations, either through sexual reproductive health, financial literacy, and things like that. So when I transitioned into being in the job market and getting to feel how the corporate space was like, I realized to say my heart was still with the community. My heart was still with human development and just ensuring that people are left better off. So then I started looking around to see what I could do in my little ways. And a friend of mine and I started doing radio where we were basically speaking about the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, unpacking them and seeing how young people can then create impact in their small little ways. So when we figured out that the initiative kept on growing and young people kept on showing interest, we then started asking how can we then make this a whole more serious thing so that more young people can leverage on what we are doing and how the sustainable development goals are affecting us or relating to our day-to-day lives. Because one of the agenda, both for the African Union, the Agenda 2063, and also Agenda 2030 for the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, the biggest question has been how do we localize them? Because conversations are had every year at the African Union, at the United Nations, but then you find that the conversations that are happening in the high-level conversations are completely different from what's happening on the ground. So the question was, how do we then localize the 17 SDGs? How do we localize Agenda 2063, the Africa we want? So when we started asking those questions, we realized to say there wasn't a youth-led organization in Zambia that was feeding into what young people needed and how young people saw themselves in these conversations around sustainable development. So we then decided to shift the conversations away from just radio conversations and social media to having things like trainings, community outreaches, to ensure that really when we're speaking about sustainable development and young people, we are actually we are sort of speaking into the lived experiences of young people, both in Zambia and across the continent. So really, the idea of starting the organization started from a personal desire to want to continue creating change, but also the massive need that young people had to understand what sustainable development was like and how they could then take part in their little communities in the country and across the continent as well.
Yeah, I think that's that's a lot there. That's a lot there. So we're gonna try to unpack as much as possible. So we're gonna take a short break and then we'll be right back. Continuing the conversation with Olivia Tutu. So sit back, we'll be right back. So if you're just joining us, please share the stream with your friends and circles. It helps with the algorithm so that at least more people can see programming like this, which is centered on youth empowerment, which is centered on education, which is centered on uplifting and bringing about meaningful change in our communities, countries, the continent at large. So let's go back to our guest, Olivia Tutu. So Olivia, you talked about your background and how you got started. So now here is a question for you. And this question is something that talks about your organization. So the question is, you founded Youth on Sustainable Development. What inspired you to establish this organization and what problems were you determined to solve? You talked about you being on the radio and talking about putting things in practicality, transitioning from social media. Now, focus on what problems were you looking at meeting?
I would say it's representation again, because the world over, conversations around young people are slowly becoming more of how do we make young people become part of development partners as compared to beneficiaries. Because before now, young people were spoken about as though they were just supposed to benefit from the development and the conversations that were happening world over. But now the question we wanted to ask is, how do we as young people decide what we want and how it should be administered to us. So young people have always been consulted, young people have always been treated as beneficiaries, but we wanted to be treated as development partners, and we want to be part of the implementation strategies and processes of these frameworks. So one would argue to say frameworks are just there for talk's sake and all of that, but to a greater extent, they do influence how decisions are then made in individual countries as well as Africa world over. So for us, we wanted to ensure that young people are not just part of the decision-making processes, but they're also part of the implementation processes. Now, the older generation normally would say, well, young people are not equipped, they don't have the right skills and all of that. And so the question also was, how do we then equip young people so that when we're saying Olivia should be part of the foreign mission of Zambia to Canada, for example, she is well equipped and she has the skills and the necessary tools that are needed. Because before now, a lot of us as young people would always say, oh no, but I'm young. And so age was the only metrics that was used for a young person to be part of the decision-making spaces. And most of the times when you're part of that, as someone who has been working with government, the United Nations and the African Union, I will tell you to say, when you're going to go in a space just for age's sake, you will find that the only thing you're going to do is sit in and not contribute at all. So we wanted young people to also bring some form of expertise to the conversation, away from the fact that you're young and away from the fact that you're part of the larger population in Africa or Zambia. How do we ensure that you also understand the conversations that are happening, and so you're going to so that you're able to actually contribute from an informed point of view and not just from the age point of view. So we wanted to solve that issue of equipping young people with the necessary tools, the necessary skills, so that yes, your age is going to open the door for you, but your expertise, your skill set is going to help you stay in the room and also contribute positively to the conversations that I had. So that was really what we were trying to, that's what we're trying to do actually as an organization.
I think I like that young people are not just sitting back watching old people like me, right? All right,
Yeah.
now keep up the good job. So now the follow-up question to that is, Zambia has a very young population. How can we better harness the energy and the talents of young people for the national development? What do we need to do?
I believe the most important thing is let's stop seeing young people as children, because I've been in spaces where you actually probably know the topics and the conversations way better than the older generation, but they'll talk to you like you're a 5th grader, or they'll talk to you like you're this 2-year-old who doesn't really understand the conversations. So I think number one is, let's see young people as development partners, ensure that we understand the role they play and what they bring to the table. And then number two, we need skills development. I think most of the times when we're speaking about young people, we're always talking about youth empowerment. And to a greater extent, lately conversations around youth empowerment has been how many young people are at a conference, how many young people are at a summit, how many young people are in these conversations. And then when we come back home, you find that there's really nothing for us as young people. So the only way we can harness the energy that young people bring to the table and the talents is ensuring that we fuse them in the structures and the implementation processes, as earlier alluded to. The president of Zambia just recently was speaking about how he wants every minister to have a young person as an intern so that they better understand conversations around development, conversations around where the country is going and all of that. Now, whether or not that is actually what's going to happen in the next year or so, we are not sure. But I believe if that then happens, then that's going to be a very good strategy, because not only will it not only will it give us the platform to actually make decisions, but it will also help us get into the inside of the conversations that are affecting our country and things like that. And also, let's not forget the largest industries in the country, which is agriculture and mining. Most of the times, it is very hard for young people to contribute in these sectors that are largely contributing to the nation's GDP, because getting land is expensive, getting farm products for you to actually start your agriculture journey is expensive. Mining too, the entry requirements are over and above for young people. So the only way we can actually harness the talents and the skills and the energy that young people have is ensuring that we structure the systems into tailor making them for young people, because before now systems were never built with young people in mind. So how do we ensure that systems now are accommodating of young people? This whole thing of, especially in the job market itself, and SDG number 8, which is decent work and economic growth, speaks about unpaid internships, speaks about how the job market has been very unfavorable to young people. So how do we ensure that even when we want someone for a certain role, we're not asking for 10 years work experience? Because then what we're saying is the system is only suitable for the people that have been in the industry for a long time. And if the larger population is young people, then we should ensure that whatever we're doing is tailor-made for young people. Because if you're going to come to me and say you want 10 years work experience and I'm 26, then I should have started working when I was 16, and that's practically impossible, especially with how the landscape is here in Zambia. Maybe the US is a bit different, because you find that college students take up part-time jobs, this, so it becomes a bit more easier for them to build experience over time. But then with a country like Zambia, no one is going to hire someone who's 18 years old. No one is going to hire someone who's 16 years old. They will want you to be of a certain age before you then get into. And then also with the economic issues that are happening around the country and just world over, the recessions and all of that, you can't go for an unpaid for internship, because you have to pay, you have to eat, you have to pay for bills, you have transportation and all of that. So really, in a nutshell, I would say, number one, we need to ensure that the systems are restructured to include young people, because for the longest time the systems were never built with us in mind. How do we restructure systems to ensure that they reflect the needs and lived realities of young people? And then number two, for industries that are largely influencing our GDP, especially, how do we ensure that the entry points for young people also is questioned a little bit? If it means, I know for a fact that the Ministry of Agriculture has things they're calling farming blocks, where they give you a piece of land and you get to do your farming activity there, and then after a certain period of time they give it to another person and things like that. So how do we ensure that it is countrywide and not just a select few are having access to that? And things like mining, we have small-scale miners that are constantly complaining about the rules and the regulations and things like that, and how our mines are being owned by foreigners. So if we want to ensure that the youth of Zambia are actually benefiting from things like that, we have to ensure that the laws, the regulations, the entry requirements are sort of questioned to reflect what a ordinary average young Zambian can be able to actually manage. So I would say that's what we need to do, ensuring that systems are built with us in mind or restructured to have us in mind, but also to ensure that the industries that have young people largely benefiting from them should question the entry requirements as well.
Yeah, I like that. There's need to restructure some of these aspects of the way things have always been done, and infuse in the expertise of the younger people, so that at least they not only do they get the experience, but at least they are part and parcel, and there's that representation in the whole process. So I like that. I like that. So now here's a follow-up question. What do you think is the biggest obstacle preventing young people from contributing fully to Zambia's development, and how can it be addressed? I know you mentioned partly to the other aspect of this question, but
Right.
how can that be addressed?
So I believe it gets back to the whole idea of considering young people as equal development partners and not
calling them children.
Not calling us children, not treating us like children, but ensuring that we are development partners. Because even the way youth development has been structured, you can even tell, for example, here in Zambia, and I think it's like an African thing. You go to any African country, you find that the Minister of Youth is above 35. You know, you find a youth chairperson is 45 years old, and it's like, but you had your time. Can you also give young people their time as well? So I believe the only way we can do that is ensuring that decision-making spaces have young people, because then young people will be able to speak into the needs of other young people that are not present in certain rooms. For example, if we're having our discussions around the national budget, can we not just consult young people? Can we also have young people in rooms where the same way the Minister of Finance will say, okay, this is making sense, this isn't making sense. Can we also have young people being in such spaces so that they can sort of speak into the needs of other young people that are not there? So I would say number one is really just having representation, because representation matters. Also, with a country like Zambia and just Africa-wise, you will notice rather to say a lot of our young people are demotivated, demoralized. They just feel like they will never be given the space, the time, and the energy to be able to speak into these things. So how do we ensure then that we have representation? Because if a young person from where I come from in Zambia, if they see Olivia being given the space to make decisions, then they too will know that it is possible for them to actually decide on what the country's agenda looks like, or the trajectory of our country and the trajectory of our economy. The only way we're going to grow as an economy, either in Africa or just Zambia, is when we have the largest population feeding into what it is we're trying to do. So it's really the representation, but also ensuring that the systems and structures are sort of revised to have young people in mind. Because for the longest time, when you are below 25 and even below 30, they will not take you seriously because they think you don't know much, you don't know better. But you will be shocked at the level of how much young people now know. A lot of people that are coming up with innovations, with technological advancements and all of that, you find that most of them are actually below 30. Some of them are even below 25. So if a young person can have innovative ways of doing things in a quicker, cheaper way, why would you then turn around and start making decisions on their behalf and consider them as a kid only when it's necessary? Are you going to consider them as a development partner? So I believe we have to move away from the idea of young people don't know better, because young people do know better, and we are the ones that are living through the consequences of the older generation. Things like climate change, like for example, Zambia recently had an El Nino-induced drought, and that's coming from decisions of many, many years ago that the older generation were making, and maybe they never even had young people in mind. But if you have young people in decision-making spaces deciding how the country or how the continent proceeds or progresses, it becomes very easy. Because for me as Olivia, I'll be thinking of what does the next 30, 50 years from now look like? Because I'm still going to be alive. My children are going to still be alive. So it then, even when you're thinking about developing in a more sustainable way and you're having young people on the table and making decisions, it then becomes easy, because we're not just thinking about now. Because I think to a greater extent, the older generation are constantly thinking about now, because they know they won't be there in the next 10 years, in the next 15 years. So whatever happens is none of their business. But for some of us, we know to say, I'm going to live up until maybe 75 or 80 or even 100. So the decisions that I'm making now should reflect how I want life to look like for the next couple of years. So it's really just ensuring that young people are considered as development partners, but also not shying away from the fact that we still do need mentorship, we still need capacity building, and we still do need to be equipped.
We are talking to Olivia Tutu, a youth advocate. She is passionate about bringing about meaningful change for the betterment of the Zambian country of Zambia and the continent at large. So if you're just joining us, share the stream with your circles, your friends, so that at least they do not miss out on important conversation that we are having on our program, especially today as we are talking to Olivia Tutu, who is talking about elderly people should not call her as a child because she is not a child. Isn't that right?
That's definitely true.
All right. So continuing the conversation, here is a follow-up question. You have worked with the United Nations. So you have worked with the United Nations agencies and participated in international forums. What lessons has representing Zambia in these spaces taught you?
I would say that we as a country need to do better, number one. And then also on a personal level, I just realized that there's no action that I do back home that is small. Because when you're in spaces like the United Nations, for example, or the African Union, the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, you tend to see that it is really the small things that we do in our day-to-day realities that contribute to the grand scheme of the sustainable development that we're speaking about. But also it calls for the need for us as a country to awaken in terms of how we treat young people and how we engage with young people, because you find places like the United States, you find places like Europe, for example, where youth participation is actually very meaningful and very engaging. But also across Africa as well, we do have countries that are very progressive in terms of youth participation and how they are integrating youth decisions into the bigger global conversations. I'll take an example of Burundi. I do have a friend of mine who's currently serving as the youth ambassador he's serving as Burundi's youth ambassador to the United Nations. And you will see how the whole diplomatic corps at the United Nations from Burundi is constantly engaging him, constantly wanting young people's opinions to be captured in the conversations that are happening at the United Nations. So when I got back home, I think that was like 2024, I realized to say we didn't have something like that in Zambia. And for me, that was a lesson to say, how do we then progressively ensure that young people are involved? Because we can't speak about youth representation, but spaces where conversations around development are happening, there isn't any representation, especially on a global stage. So it's really just picking up lessons from different countries across the continent, but world over as well, to see how does meaningful youth engagement look like in Canada, for example? How does meaningful youth engagement look like at the EU? And how can youth engagement look like back home in Zambia, but also at the African Union, to ensure that no young person is really left behind and the interests of young people are captured in every conversations that we have. So for me, it's really understanding to say you're never too young, you're never too small, and no action is too little to contribute to development. It's really the little things: switch and save. If you're not using electricity, switch it off. If you're not using water, switch it off. If you have leftover food, don't throw it away because there's somebody who doesn't have food. So yeah, when you're in the bigger rooms and conversations are happening, you tend to realize to say the conversations there are really just speaking about how can we do better as humanity in our day-to-day lives, and how can we be better stewards towards one another, first of all, and also to the planet as well, because we only have one earth, and if we don't take care of it, then unfortunately future generations may not have a home. So it's really things like that.
Yeah, it's always good to think about the future, living in the moment, but at least having a forecast for how things will be like, and what type of environment are we living or creating for those who come. Now, here is a follow-up question, just trying to switch gears a little bit. Zambia will soon be celebrating its 62nd independence anniversary. What do you think your generation owes those who fought for freedom? Those people who are calling you children, what do you think they did?
One of the questions that I always ask my peers, especially when we're having conversations around youth participation, is Kenneth Kaunda and his friends gave us the political freedom. What will our generation give to future generations? And so this question being thrown at me is funny because I have taken time to reflect on it, but also just coining the response towards it is a bit of a stretch. But I would say we do owe people that fought for our independence a lot, and we do owe future generations a whole lot in terms of how we show up today. And for me, I believe what we need to do is to economically liberate ourselves as a continent and as a country as well. We have the political freedom, but do we have the financial freedom? Because Zambia is still borrowing, Zambia is still receiving aid. And for me, that aches my heart because I believe we can do so much better. Part of Agenda 2063's agenda at the African Union is making Africa a powerhouse by 2063. And I believe the only way Africa is going to be a powerhouse by 2063 is if individual African countries are powerhouses themselves. So in the sense of Zambia, it really gets back to the whole idea of we do have the political freedom. We're able to make decisions in terms of who we elect and all of that. We're having our elections just a few days to go. But the question is, do we really have the financial freedom or the economic freedom as a country? And the answer is no, because our spendings are largely influenced by the terms and the conditions that the grants and the loans come with. So for me, I believe is the question that we're answering as my generation is, how do we give Zambia the economic freedom that it needs? Because when we have economic freedom, then we can be able to make decisions that reflect what our values are, what our needs are, and what our lived experiences are as a people. So it's really the economic freedom. How do we get to that space where we as a country can self-sustain ourselves?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, because you see, the African Union itself is dependent, is like a child to the Western countries that are funding it. So when you are depending on somebody else, then they dictate your terms. So African countries need to emancipate themselves and position the countries in such a way that they do not have to be begging for aid. So that's number
Right.
one. And then number two, it's also important for people like you getting involved so that at least you are shaping the course and the direction for the country. And I'm happy that I think with the upcoming elections, Zambia is not very much filled up with a lot of old people in parliament. And I think even this new election cycle coming up, the presidential election, I think there are a lot of younger folks. But I think from you, you consider them very old people. But we hope that I think in the future, then things will
We
come.
will
But
have
yes,
a
economic factors are key.
yeah.
So let me ask you: do you see yourself running for office at some point?
I've been getting that question so many times, and as it stands, the answer is no. But I don't really know what the future holds. I, for one, never saw myself in the development space, but here I am speaking into conversations around development. Yes, so maybe someday, but for now, I would take it as a no.
Good.
Yeah.
All right. So here is a follow-up question to that. What message would you like to leave with young Zambians who are watching you? You have a lot of followers, people across, not only in Zambia, but let's break this question into two. Speak to the young Africans looking up at you, somebody younger like you. And also the second part to this is focus it on the young Zambians watching you.
Right. So as part of our mandate as an organization is to train 10,000 young people by 2030 to be agents of development in their communities. And the reason is simple. Yes, we do have the numbers as young people. We are the largest population to have ever existed in the entirety of humanity. That's both in Zambia, in Africa, and world over. So to the African youth that is watching this, my call to action for you is, let's not wait until we are older. We can create change. We can create impact in our little small ways now. But also there's a saying that goes, divided we fall, united we stand. So in order for us to actually be able to influence change and create the change we want to see as young people of Africa, we need to unite. There's so much power in unity. There's so much power in numbers, but with greater unity, we can do so much. The fact that we don't have any country in Africa that is run by a young person is a bit of a concern, because if we are the largest population, then we are the largest voters then. So why are we voting against ourselves? So that's a question that I would like us to answer, even as we soldier on as the youth of Africa. But to the Zambian youth also, the change we want to see is us. And I believe it's very important that we are much more loyal to our country than political parties, because political parties come and go, but we have one Zambia. And if we don't take care of Mother Zambia in the next 15 years, in the next 50 years, we may not have the Zambia that we see today. So you as a young person, your loyalty is to Zambia. And the question that you should constantly ask yourself every single time you wake up is, what's my contribution to making Zambia a better place for me, and also for the rest of our citizens? Because that is your true mandate as a citizen of the country, but also the citizen of a continent. Thank you.
What else do you want to share with our listeners? And then we'll follow it up, because I had some questions that I shared. Is there anything else that you want to share, and also talk about how people can follow you, where they can keep up with you?
Right. I think the one project that I have right now is my book. I recently wrote a book. It is called Authentic, A Life Chosen, Not Given. And it speaks to, I would say, young Zambians, but also young Africans, and anybody who's really all about authentic living. So the book is basically speaking about, it's a memoir, but it also encompasses a lot of lessons that I've picked up, especially in the development space, on how the trajectory of Africa looks like and how I see Africa and Zambia from my lens. So it's going to be out in September, and I do hope that people can purchase copies. It's going to be available on Amazon, but also for those in Zambia, they can always hit me up on my socials. That is Olivia Tutu across all social media platforms to basically get a copy. I believe it's a book that I wish I read when I was starting out, especially as a young adult, just out of high school, to better understand the landscape of Zambia, but also the landscape of Africa, and how my contribution then would look like. Yeah.
Well said. We look forward to the book. And for us who are not in Zambia, how do we get access to the book?
So it's gonna be made available on Amazon.
Oh, okay, good. Yeah. So if you just let us know once it's out, then we'll do the needful. Otherwise, it's been a great pleasure having this conversation with you. We wish you well, and we look forward to the book coming up. And for everybody out there, we encourage you to follow Olivia Tutu on her social media page and other platforms, so that at least you are able to tag along with what is happening. Hopefully we will be seeing you in the coming year. Maybe, you never know, in the next 5 to 10 years, you'll be president of Zambia.
Yeah, let's see how the future looks.
All right. Thank you, Olivia.